try to have you ask the question. I will ask the questions of the speaker throughout. All right.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to present, to Sam, to everybody else. So today I'm going to present the results of two different papers on fiscal effects. One is a paper for the US and the other one is a paper for Italy. So the paper for the US is joint work with Census, SIs, Johns Hopkins and Walter Steingras at Bank of Canada. And the paper on Italy is joint work with Rama and Rama Mariani from Roma 3, Furio Camillo Rosati, Tor Vergata, and Antonio Sparacino from the Bank of Italy.
Maybe we can
Just
just a little bit. It's not her screen that's the problem. The screen is.
I think on the computer on the Zoom you have to click. Got it.
But I don't see that
He doesn't
thing.
have it on his screen. Who's projecting?
I'm projecting, but I don't see it, unfortunately.
Wait.
It's the consensus.
Try to click on Zoom app.
Maybe.
Go to, because I'm recording it. Okay.
Your screen sharing.
But her screen is not showing.
But I don't see this thing. Maybe I stop and do it again. Maybe I'll stop for a second.
Okay.
And then I still don't see this meeting getting recorded thing.
Wait. Try to do
No problem.
Windows tab, and then you can see
Because
everything.
we.
All right.
Wait. Okay, because this one.
Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Okay.
Wonderful.
All right. We're learning.
And now try to. Okay.
Then Control Alt. And now we don't see Control Alt here. Oh, there you go. Perfect. All right.
Great.
Sorry about that.
Just technology.
All right.
This is good.
How to get rid of the- okay.
Should we unmute?
No, you're good.
No.
Okay. Okay, good. So let me tell you what we mean by fiscal effects. The fiscal effects of immigration are the impact of immigration on tax revenues, public expenditures, the finance provision of public goods, and in general, the size of the welfare state. And in both the US and the Italy paper, we look at fiscal effects at the local level. So for the US at the county level, for Italy at the level of municipalities, comuni. Now, let me immediately make the point that there is a ton of policy interest, and you may know about it on fiscal effects of migration. Just to give you a sense, in the United States, there is this very important report by the National Academy of Science on immigration that came out in 2016, and they devote 2 chapters to the labor market channel, which is the channel that has completely overtaken the literature on migration, 3 chapters to fiscal effects and 1 chapter to all other effects. So this is to tell you the policymakers, if anything, care more about these fiscal effects than labor market effects. Yet there is not a lot of literature, academic literature. So the papers that there are on the fiscal effects of immigration use 2 approaches, the existing papers. Either an accounting approach. So what they do is to calculate as an accountant how much immigrants pay in taxes, how much they receive, they quantify how much they receive in services, and then they do the difference, and they can do it over a generation. But it's very much an accounting exercise. Or what they do is to construct a macro model, and then they simulate, they calibrate the macro model. Now, these approaches are very important. They give us very important insights, but they also require making very strong assumptions. So, for example, in the National Academy of Science report, there are several different scenarios that they need to consider, and for each of these scenarios, they get very different results, depending on the assumption that you make on, for example, how you change expenditures on pure public goods when immigrants arrive. So when immigrants arrive, should we increase spending on public defense? Well, you may have different ideas about that. Why would you increase spending on public defense, which is a pure public good, when you have an increase in the number of immigrants? But depending on that assumption, you get opposite results. Now, we think that it's very important to complement the results in the literature with a reduced form analysis of these fiscal effects. The advantage of the reduced form analysis is that you can not only avoid making assumptions, the data will tell you, and then you can capture automatically both the direct and indirect fiscal effect of immigrants. Because, you know, for example, in the analysis that we do, we're not only going to capture how much immigrants pay in taxes, but also how the amount of taxes paid by natives is affected by the arrival of immigrants. Mm-hmm. So when immigrants arrive, to the extent that they increase GDP, that there is a labor market surplus, then natives will pay more in taxes. Mm-hmm. And this type of effect is not captured in the previous approaches, this indirect effect. Okay, so now let me tell you why it's important to analyze these fiscal effects. Well, there is evidence that voters care quite a lot about these fiscal effects. And it makes sense because voters care about net income. So income net of taxes, and voters care about having access to public goods, and public goods and taxes is exactly what we're talking about in these papers. Now, there is evidence in the public opinion literature that, for example, across countries in the world, in situations where low-skilled immigrants arrive to a country, voters tend to become more anti-migration, and it is especially rich voters. And the reason is that rich voters fear that they will end up paying higher taxes. So this is a lot of the literature and attitudes towards migrants that finds this result. There's also one paper that finds that actually also low-income people worry when low-skilled migrants arrive, because they worry that public goods might be overcrowded. Think about public schools. If migrants arrive, there might be the possibility that these goods decrease in quantity or in quality. Now, with high-skilled migration, you are likely to have the opposite effects. I will walk you through the effects from a theoretical point of view. Another reason why it's important to look at these fiscal effects is that now there is this large literature on how immigration affects elections. In Europe, a lot of papers have found that when immigrants arrive, especially low-skilled migrants, the electoral success of right-wing parties increases. And I have a paper for the US that finds the same. When we look at the impact of low-skilled migrants, we find that in counties in the US where low-skilled migrants go, the Republican vote share goes up. And these effects tend to be more pronounced in locations where the welfare state is bigger. So people tend to worry more, not less, where the welfare state is bigger. Because, you know, you might think where the welfare state is bigger, there's going to be more of a safety net. No, they worry more because they worry about the concerns I mentioned before. The higher income people worry that they may pay higher taxes. And the low income people, they worry about the fact that they will be subject to overcrowding public goods. Okay, now related to what I just said, the fiscal impact of migration is very important above and beyond immigration, because to the extent that immigration has negative impacts on the welfare state, so it reduces the ability of governments to pay for the welfare state, then we are in trouble more broadly in terms of the globalization agenda. What do I mean? Well, countries, governments use the welfare state as a way to convince public opinion about globalization. So to convince especially those who lose from globalization, they use the safety net to compensate the losers, and that way they have been able to win support for globalization. But to the extent that the arrival of migrants weakens the welfare state, reduces the size of the welfare state, then more broadly, this globalization agenda is at risk. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, let me walk you through how the fiscal impact of immigration works. So first, I'm gonna go through the steps intuitively. I have a little theoretical framework for those of you who have questions, but all the information actually is here in what I wrote in this slide. And I am going to differentiate between the arrival of low-skilled and high-skilled migrants. So basically, we are thinking of a framework in which there is a balanced budget rule. So governments cannot run a deficit, and they tend not to run a surplus. They need to break even. Revenues more or less equal to expenditures. So when, say, low-skilled migrants arrive, what happens is that, and this is independent of whether they decrease wages or not, average income goes down. So the reason why average income goes down when low-skilled migrants arrive, even if there are no effects on wages, is simply because of a compositional effect. So if you have a certain average income and a bunch of poorer people arrive, average income mechanically goes down. And that is true not just with migrants. It is true with Americans, with Italians, with French. Anytime a group of people who are poorer than the average in an existing population, average income will go down. But when average income goes down, it means that the tax base goes down. Okay, so there will be a tendency for tax revenues to go down. Now, what can governments do to offset that? They can increase tax rates. Or the central government can send more transfers to local governments. Here we're talking about local governments experiencing these changes from a fiscal point of view. But if neither the increase in tax rates nor the greater transfers from the central government fully compensate the reduction in the tax base, what will happen is that tax revenues, and I'm talking in per capita terms, go down, which means through the budget constraint, the per capita public expenditures will go down. And so it means that the local government will be able to pay for fewer goods, public goods and services in per capita terms. Now, with high-skilled migrants, you are likely to have all the opposite effects. Now, let me just make a spoiler, which is that for the US, we find effects which are quite consistent with these statements. Except a couple of surprises. For Italy, we find results which are a little bit different. And the reason is how the fiscal system works at the local level in Italy. By the way, at the local level, income tax revenues are not the most important source of revenues. It is property tax revenues and sales tax revenues that are the most important sources of revenues. So here, when I talk about the tax base, don't think only about average income, but also about house prices, which are the tax base for property tax revenues. Okay, so
can I ask a question?
Yes.
And so what about, I mean, is there not an offsetting of a larger tax base, or do low-skilled migrants in your model just, you know, not pay? I mean, how are you adjusting for this, the fact that you have a larger share or a larger number of individuals in that model?
No, you're right. Total tax base increases, but we're measuring all outcome variables in per capita terms.
Okay.
So basically, the total revenues will increase, but then what matters is total revenues per capita. And total revenues per capita will depend, you can see it here. So if you think about the budget constraint, this is the tax rate, this is the total income, this is the price of the per capita benefit, the benefit that goes to each individual, and this is the population. Then if you divide both sides by the population, what matters is average income and per capita tax revenues. So although total revenues increase, if they increase less than the total population, per capita revenues will decrease.
We also have a question from Lars.
Hi, yeah, just a quick question. So I see, of course, that these predictions come out of the model, but I just wanted to ask you what you think about also considering the propensity of migrants to actually consume public goods. So, for instance, you do distinguish between low and high skilled. But we also know, for instance, that migrants on average are much younger than the native population. So some public goods would be less likely to be consumed, others would be more likely to be consumed. Just wanted to get your intuition on that, because that could also influence the per capita provision of public goods, right? If the propensity to consume is lower.
So let me, this is a very good point. Basically, what we are looking at in these papers is all those programs in the welfare state that redistribute from the rich to the poor. We are not looking at programs that redistribute from the young to the old, like the pension system. And those are programs that, for the most part, are run at the central government level. So for that type of program, one very important characteristic of migrants is the age. And so you're right, then there, the fact that migrants, besides being a lot of times, not always, low skilled, they're also young, counts in the favor of making their contribution more positive. But for programs that redistribute income from the rich to the poor, to the extent that migrants are lower skilled and poorer, then just for natives, when they come in, that's how the welfare state is supposed to work. It's supposed to redistribute to people who are poorer. So if somebody who's poorer comes in, there will be a redistribution from those who are already there, who were the natives, towards this low-skilled population. But it might be both if low-skilled migrants arrive, but also if low-skilled natives arrive. So, for example, if there is internal migration within a country, think about migration from the south of Italy to the north of Italy in the 50s and 60s, the same type of mechanism. It's not something about migrants per se, but it is about the skill level. So another point related to the question is that in this analysis, we're not gonna break down, we're not gonna be able to break down expenditures into expenditures targeted at natives and expenditures targeted at migrants. We consider per capita expenditures at the local level. Okay, so now let me tell you a couple of things about the local level in the US in terms of public finance. Well, the local level is very important. In the United States, it accounts for 1/4 of total expenditures and total revenues. And the other important point is that local governments in the US, by local governments I mean counties, cities, towns, school districts, we aggregate all these local micro levels up to the county level. And there are around 3,000 counties in the US. Well, they raise most of their revenues by themselves. Only for less than half, 41% of their revenues comes from transfers from the federal and state governments. And given that they raise a lot of their own revenues, they decide how to spend it. And for the most part, they get revenues from property tax revenues and sales tax revenues, a little bit of income tax revenues, and they spend on very important goods and services. In the US, they spend on K-12 education. So Americans care a lot about the local level because, for example, it matters a lot for the education of their kids. And importantly, as I said, local governments in the US, but also in Italy, need to run a balanced budget. In Italy, more recently, in the US has been the case for a while. So what do we do in the paper? We look at the impact in a reduced format of the arrival of low-skilled and high-skilled migrants to US counties between 1990 and 2010, okay? And we estimate a causal effect. If you want the details, I can go over those, but I'm not going to focus on those today. Okay, let me tell you what we find. So what we find, which is definitely from a policy point of view very important, is that on average, low-skilled and high-skilled migrants who arrived to the United States between 1990 and 2010, which is the period we analyze, had an impact close to zero on per capita expenditures on public goods and services. So basically, the high-skilled migrants more or less compensated, offset the impact of low-skilled migrants. So we calculate that all the immigrants who came between 1990 and 2010 had an impact, a negative impact, but of 0.3%, which is very tiny. So it's a well-identified zero, basically. But we also find, consistent with the theoretical model, that there is a lot of heterogeneity by skill. Low-skilled migrants decreased per capita revenues and per capita expenditures. High-skilled migrants increased them. And these effects, we find, work through the impact on the tax base. So we find that average income goes down when low-skilled migrants arrive, and average income goes up when high-skilled migrants arrive. We find that house prices go down and go up, respectively, when low and high-skilled migrants arrive. Now, the issue is, from a policy point of view, that this result that I give you here basically holds for the average county. It holds for the county that received, on average, the same share of low and high-skilled migrants as the US as a whole. But practically no county in the US looks like the average county. Some counties receive more low-skilled migrants, and some counties receive more high-skilled migrants. So these results on heterogeneity by skill level imply that there is a lot of heterogeneity across counties. So some counties will experience a negative effect, and some counties experienced a positive effect. Now, the good thing is that if redistribution was carried out, the gain of those counties that received high-skilled migrants would be more or less enough to compensate the losses of those who received low-skilled migrants. So basically what we find is that the redistribution that takes place from the federal government is not enough to compensate. So they are not redistributing from one set of counties to the other. And then we also analyze the impact of second-generation migrants. In the US, second-generation migrants make a positive contribution from a fiscal point of view, which is bigger than Americans. So second-generation migrants are very important. They have very positive effects. And that's something that also the report of the National Academy of Science finds.
Yeah, so just on a question that, because we had a seminar, I think last week, where we were looking at the Israeli. Oh, sorry, yeah.
No.
I'm forgetting about the audience. So we had a seminar last week looking at Israeli migrants integrating into the market as they moved in. So do you have any idea how in Israel? So it was looking at movement of people into Israel from outside, and they had a number of, even after 25 years, not everyone is fully, as in not everyone looks like a native is completely fully integrated. So do you have any idea with the data you've been looking at how long it would take for people to go? Because you're talking about first generation, second generation, but I'm thinking when low skilled people arrive, do you have any gauge about how long it takes them to look like the skill composition of or does that ever happen, or is that just
well, so in the United States, second generation migrants, so the kids of the foreign born, they have a positive impact. So they increase revenues and they do not increase expenditures. So they increase the service at the local level. So there is a lot of work in the United States by Yabustan, Rana Braminsky that shows that second generation migrants have super high social upward mobility in the United States. Now, in Europe, it is less the case. I don't know about Israel, but my sense is that how second generation migrants integrate varies a lot across countries. So a very nice paper was presented at the migration conference about Germany, and that paper shows that the extent of integration of second generation migrants depends a lot on laws about citizenship at birth, jus soli versus jus sanguinis. So they show that in Germany, when they changed the law, it made a big difference in terms of how much education second generation migrants were getting, the tracks they selected, how well they did, and it is because they felt more belonging. Okay.
May I also ask a question? So you say this is the overall expenditures do not change or they decrease, increase, but do you look at types of expenditures? Like
yes, we do. And I'm going to skip through the technical part and I'm going to give you first some magnitudes for the United States. What we find is that first for revenues, these are the coefficients, but what they imply is that all the low-skilled migrants who came between 1990 and 2010 reduced in the average county on revenues by 8.4%. And this is per capita revenues. And the high-skilled migrants increased per capita on revenues by 6%. And if you take the difference is not trivial, it's 2.4%, but this is revenues. But still, these are own revenues. We haven't accounted for transfers from the central government that then impact public expenditures. So when you look at public expenditures, you see that these two effects, the negative effect of low-skilled migrants and the positive effect are very close, and the difference is 0.3% per year in per capita terms. Okay, so now let me give you an example. So this is how heterogeneous the effects are. These are for revenues. The reds are positive impacts. The blues are negative impacts. Now, why do we have a lot of reds up in the north and in the northeast? Because actually we observed a decrease in the share of low-skilled migrants in those locations. And when you go from per capita revenues to per capita expenditures, you have more light blues.
Sorry, so you observe a decrease in the share of migrants and therefore there's a positive impact. Is it not related to anything? I apologize, I work in Canada and the US, but Canada does steal a lot of the migrants from the US. Does it have anything to do with any timing of reforms in Canada that are taking the low-skilled migrants north?
So you mean whether there is any spillover effect from Canada to the US?
The composition change might have been a result of, I'm just wondering if this change in the composition of low-skilled workers may have been a result of more like a pulling factor from Canada.
I see. It might be. I never thought about it. What I thought was going on, because so if you do the same map with the change in the shares of low-skilled migrants, you see that they are decreasing. I thought that there are migrants who came longer ago, and so they are dying basically, and the new migrants are not going there. They tend to go to other areas of the country. But I don't know, that's something to look into, the fact that you're thinking that they may move to Canada from there.
I think the majority of the trade and movement of people on that border, I mean, particularly from a Canadian point of view, is across, up and down from the border. So I would think that the most
logical kind of response for why this changed. I mean, if that's something that you would be interested in, would be a pull from Canadian migration.
Well, no, that makes a lot of sense also because, you know, in Canada, they have better social welfare programs. Yes, that's something to look into. It would be very interesting to look at that. And but to give you an example about how different results can be, consider these two counties, Presidio County in Texas and Monterey County in California. Presidio County in Texas received mostly low-skilled migrants, Monterey County mostly high-skilled migrants. Well, on net, in Presidio County, per capita revenues, per capita expenditures went down by 15%, and in Monterey they went up by 14%. So there is a lot of heterogeneity, and this is the distribution of the effects on per capita expenditures. Now, I think, so the majority of the effects are concentrated here around zero, but there are definitely some counties in the tails. And of course, if you happen to be one of those counties in the left tail, you're not happy. So this is to say that these local fiscal effects are likely to be very important in the political economy and migration policy in the United States. As a matter of fact, now you see these counties in Texas, in Florida, which are sending migrants to New York, to Chicago. By the way, now even New York and Chicago are pushing migrants out.
It's full of migrants anyway, so.
Yes, they're paying for the ticket for them to leave. Because in New York, they have to guarantee good living conditions. Okay, so now let me, in terms of spending, so you get the same effects as in total for different spending categories. So if low-skilled migrants arrive, per capita spending goes down in total, and for most categories, except we don't find that per capita education spending goes down. So there, what we think is that there are transfers that target specifically education. And so that's offset. And for high-skilled migrants, what we find, which is very interesting, is that when high-skilled migrants arrive, per capita spending on police decreases, and it is because when high-skilled migrants arrive, per capita crime rates go down in the US. When low-skilled migrants arrive, they don't change. We don't find that they increase. When low-skilled migrants arrive, there is no change in per capita crime rates. Okay, so now, yes.
So I was thinking a bit about the temporal aspect of it, and if you were able to investigate that at all, because in your theoretical model, it's almost a two-step like mechanism, right? First the high school migrants come, average income goes up, and then the fiscal, like the local government makes a decision about how to change their expenditure and their budget. So, but since in the specification, it's to change from 1990 to 2010, is there any possibility to kind of look at how maybe if there's a lag, or if you are able to observe the lag?
Yeah, so basically we have data for 3 points in time, 1990, 2000, and 2010. So we cannot do much in terms of lag effects. We could potentially in the future, because actually the data for public expenditures is every 5 years. The problem is the matching with the migration data. But for now, we are looking at contemporaneous effects within a decade. You know, within a decade, you would think is enough for these effects to take place. In the case of Italy, we have much higher frequency data, but for a shorter period of time. Okay, so now let me get to, so I'm gonna skip this, the Italian paper. So in the Italian paper, we analyze data between 2008 and 2015 at the level of municipalities. There are around 7,000 comuni, municipalities in Italy. And let me give you a preview of the results that we find, because here we find a result which is surprising given the theoretical framework that I presented. We find that the arrival of migrants to Italy, and migrants to Italy either are low-skilled or are employed in low-skilled occupations because there is downgrading of occupations. Yet, when they arrive to a municipality, they improve the fiscal conditions of the municipality. Now, what do we mean by they improve? They increase total revenues, they don't change total expenditures, and the reason why they increase total revenues is that they increase property tax revenues. And the reason why they increase property tax revenues is not because of the changes in house values. Because in Italy, cadastral values don't change over time. The last time they were updated was in the late 90s, in 1997. So there is not that variation. In the US, if you own a house, every year you receive the letter with the new evaluation of your house, and property taxes went up. In Italy, the cadastral value is given, and if there are no policy changes, you pay pretty much the same. But so what is going on? Why does the arrival of low-skilled migrants increase property tax revenues? Well, the evidence that we find seems to suggest that what is going on is related to a policy change made by Berlusconi. So what Berlusconi did was to get rid of the property tax rate on owner-occupied houses. It kept it on secondary houses. So your country house, your beach house, the house in the mountain. But if you declare a house as owner occupied, you basically pay zero, except in 2012. But still, even in 2012, you would pay less in owner occupied relative to secondary houses. But so then, you know, in Italy, the fiscal burden is very strong for those who pay taxes. There is a lot of tax evasion, but for those who pay taxes, the tax rates are very high. So taxpayers are very strategic. Even if you want to be within the law, you can be strategic. And so what happens is that you can choose which house to declare as first or second house according to the tax rates. And actually, there is a paper by Giuseppe Ipedico, who's at Nottingham, that shows exactly that. Shows that people change fiscal residence. They don't necessarily move, but change fiscal residence as a function of the change in property tax rates. But then what happens? When when migrants arrive, they're less likely to buy a house. They're more likely to rent. So Italians or local residents start renting their houses to migrants, but at that point, they cannot declare the house as owner-occupied. Also because the migrants in Italy need the contract to get the permesso di soggiorno. So they need the contract. It's not like they rent the house in the black market. And so once the Italians rent the house, they have to declare the house as secondary residence, they pay the higher tax rate, and that's what we think is going on, because we find that the most robust result is that property tax revenues increase for secondary residences. So that's the main result. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the local level in Italy. In Italy, expenditures at the local level account for a smaller fraction than total expenditures. They account for 9%. So I think that's important because basically people know that for the most part they will get public goods and services from the central government. I think people in general care less than in the US, because in the US they're getting much more, especially education. And again, though, the localities in Italy are quite they're independent in the sense that they get most of their revenues from their own sources. Transfers account for 30% of total revenues. And the property tax revenues are the most important. Income tax revenues are very small. It's addizionale IRPEF for the, I don't know if there are any Italians online. What are the main goods and services that are paid with local revenues? Well, population registry services. Next, daycare centers. Daycare centers are important, and also infrastructure, so buildings for schools. They also pay for social protection programs for disadvantaged households. And so even also migrants, if they fit in the description. And then another important service provided by local governments is garbage collection, and public transportation is another big one. So let me tell you actually what we find in terms of expenditures. What we find is that in terms of current revenues, they go up, just like total revenues, they go up, and also current expenditures go up. Total expenditures don't go up because current expenditures go up and capital expenditures go down. But the amount of money available to spend for current public goods goes up. And so there is more provision of garbage collection in per capita terms, municipal police, what we call law and order, then culture and religion, which might be related to the arrival of migrants, and public transportation. So, for example, public transportation makes a lot of sense because low-skilled migrants are more likely to use public transportation than locals. So here, what we think is going on is that both that feature of the Italian fiscal system makes it so that there is more money to be spent, but also there is more demand when immigrants arrive. So there is more demand for public transportation services, for culture and religion programs, and this demand is met both with the higher revenues coming from the secondary houses, but also we find evidence that property tax rates go up as well.
We have a question from the
yes,
Lars.
Yeah, just a quick clarification question on the revenue versus expenditure, because I mean, of course, these two are mechanically linked, right? If you have higher revenue, then you have more fiscal space to increase expenditure. So I understand that you, to some extent, try to disentangle where the effect actually comes from. But I'm wondering what the limitations of this is, because as you said, the margin that for instance, the local governments have to raise more locally might be a little bit limited because they can only maybe change the property tax a little bit. So say if there is now a huge need for higher expenditure, would that not maybe be compensated by some kind of fiscal formula that the central government would transfer more to the local government? So I'm just having trouble to wrap my head around like how exactly we would disentangle all these things that go on at the same
yes,
time.
no, you're right. So for example, what we observe is that transfers increase, and transfers are related here. Let me show you. Transfers increase, they are related to population-based formulas. So, but basically what we do is to analyze different sources of revenues and expenditures, but also look at how the tax base has changed. This is the piece that I haven't yet talked about. So when, for example, we observe that property tax revenues go up, we break down that into, let me show you, property tax rates, both for the main residents, for the secondary residents, and deductions, and then we see how much of the increase in the revenues is driven by the changes in tax rates by controlling for them. So here what we observe is that although the tax rates went up, when you control for the tax rates, still immigration increases revenues, which means that not all the increase in revenues is driven by the increase in property tax rates. So it must mean that there is also an increase in the tax base. Okay, so basically the revenue is a combination of the base and the tax rates. When immigrants arrive, what we observe is that the base increases, the tax base for property taxes increases because of that country house thing. But at the same time, local governments also increase property tax rates, because my reading is that probably they don't expect property tax revenues to increase. They probably expect to have to raise more money because they see migrants arriving, so they increase the property tax rates, and they also get more money from the central government. And I think it's for the same reason. But then on top of these changes by governments, policy changes, we also observe that the tax base increases. Now, let me show you instead what happens for income tax revenues, because that's interesting. So for income tax revenues, we find that there is no impact. We do find that the tax base in per capita terms decreases. So the average income in a municipality where migrants goes down. We find that the tax rate doesn't change. And so we were a little bit puzzled if the tax base goes down quite a lot and the tax rate doesn't seem to change, if anything, decrease. Why is nothing happening to the income tax revenues? So then what we did is to look at what happens to the distribution of income across income categories. And what we see is that when migrants arrive, there is a redistribution taking place from the bottom income categories. So for the bottom income categories, you see you have all these negatives per taxpayer income in the bottom 4 income categories goes down when immigrants arrive, and per taxpayer income in the top 4 income categories goes up. And I'm going to get to your question. In Italy, the tax system is very progressive. So if you transfer $1 from the bottom to the top, you're going to increase revenues. So that is what we think is going on. Although average income went down, this redistribution compensates that. And so tax revenues for income don't go down.
Yeah, very quickly on that. This is total population or also including the migrants?
So this is per taxpayer. It includes migrants pay taxes, so it includes the migrants, yes.
We also have a question, right? On Matteo, can you unmute?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, just a very quick clarification about that. So you used the share of immigrants of the year before, because I think that giving, the positive results you have on public expenditures, more public transportation and more garbage collection, I think that you need to control also for reverse causality, in the sense that maybe a migrant would like to go to a place where they have higher public expenditure. So I'm not sure if maybe you're using the lag of the share of immigrants or something like that. Maybe I missed it.
So this is a very good point. It's related to whether we are estimating causal effects. For that, I skipped those tables, but we investigate reverse causality. So basically, we investigate whether a change in the fiscal variables in the pre-period has an impact on the share of immigrants in each municipality. And we don't find evidence of that. And then we also do a falsification exercise. So what we do is to see whether the change in the share of immigrants in our period of analysis explains the change in fiscal variables in the pre-period. And we don't find evidence of that. So I take your point that we should try a specification with the lag variables, but it's not, I think, because of reverse causality. It's more that it takes time for local governments to realize what's going on and make changes.
Microphone.
Yes.
Something.
Yes.
My idea is that if with this reduced form analysis, we account for both mechanical effects, compositional effects, and the labor market market effects. If we use the lagged variables of immigration, we take account only on market effects, because expenditure and revenues at the local level are related to the current population. So if you use the current migrations, you account also for the compositional effects.
Yes.
Otherwise, you take account only of the market effects.
Yeah.
Maybe one quick question, although we have 7 minutes. Talking about composition, so I don't know what you have in the controls, but are you taking into account the changes in the composition of natives? First, do you check whether there's a native displacement in response? And B, if there is, do you think it could be due to the compositional changes, although you might probably control it?
So that's in the to-do list. That's on top of our to-do list to look at internal mobility. That's something that we would like to do. Yeah, and actually there was a presentation yesterday where they used very nice data on internal mobility. We're going to use that, but we haven't done that yet.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure, we have 5 minutes, but go for it. 6.
Okay, well, it's kind of summarizing a little bit of your messages until now and then kind of launching to the next step. So in the first paper, you're really saying the low-skilled migrants' impact is on lower expenditure in the US. But in Italy, you're saying that low-skilled migrants come, but there's an offsetting factor because of housing policy. And so the main factor that is driving the difference between the two results is that there's some sort of intentional or unintentional redistribution that is going through the housing effect.
Yes. So basically, you're right, because in a sense, what's going on is that house owners are, by paying taxes on secondary residences, are more than compensating whatever negative impact there is from poorer individuals entering the welfare state. In that sense, you were thinking of the redistribution. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
No, and that's kind of interesting because I mean, in that sense, then you kind of have that message rather to come out. This is that whole approach to addressing some of the fiscal challenges of migration. And I think like the reference to the Israeli report from last week that was presented, it was also making the case that there might be some time it might take before there's essentially a better outcome for migrants. So in that case, it was more about Eastern European migrants coming into Israel and taking essentially 2 years, I think, until they're basically reaching up to the wage levels of locals.
Yeah.
So it seems to be rather that your messages might be surrounding the fact that there may be heterogeneous effects, but essentially the local policies on a subnational level are really the drivers of change and potentially impacts over time.
Yes. And this point about the extent to which redistribution takes place intentionally or unintentionally, because in the Italian case, also, with the fact that at the end the local level matters less, I think implies that from a political economy point of view, these local effects I would expect to matter less. In the US, they matter more because if you are stuck in a county where there are these negative effects, then it's a vicious cycle. Your kids go to a worse school, and because there is not as much of a redistribution from the central government in the US.
So 3 minutes. So
yes, so basically I am done with what I wanted to say. I covered let me make one point. There is this literature on the impact of the arrival of immigrants on attitudes towards redistribution. So whether people want to have a large welfare state or a small welfare state. And Alberto Alessina pioneered with co-authors the literature, and the expectation is that when immigrants arrive, either because they are different from an ethnic racial point of view, or because they're poorer, attitudes towards redistribution decrease. But actually we don't find evidence of that. So we find that tax rates go up, and we find that expenditures go up. So I think that's, and by the way, also in the United States, we find that property tax rates go up. So I think that's a point that we should investigate a bit more. And again, I wonder whether that is related to the local level, given that you always think, because, you know, from a certain, to a certain extent, the fact that attitudes towards redistribution decrease when immigrants arrive is a little bit myopic, I think, in the sense that once you know that immigrants have arrived, whether you like it or not, you should realize that it's better if they integrate. And so to integrate immigrants, you do need to have programs to integrate them. And at the local level, I think, you know that to a certain extent, the central government will come in and help you to do that. So we should push that point more.
Okay, one last question, if I may. You know, we discussed it earlier. So migration could be a solution for a remedy for depopulation, regions losing population. And in Italy, it is an important issue. So far you presented results on per capita, but any thoughts on the total effects and whether this could be a solution? Of course, migrants go to where they want and they go to booming places. But if you know.
Yes, like whether one should have dispersal policies that target areas that they populate. So let me say one thing. We did all the analysis in per capita terms, but it is true that there are public goods for which it makes more sense to consider the total. Now, I think those are public goods that work more at the central government level. Because at the local level, especially for the United States, there are many services that act like private goods. But to the extent that you're thinking about, for example, the park,
or continuity of services, right? Raising enough money to
have
collect,
a school
or collect garbage,
Yes, then you're right that as long as there is an increase in population, it's going to be a positive effect from a fiscal point of view. So I guess one thing is to, but it's difficult to differentiate between locally provided public goods that are public goods in the economic sense and locally provided public goods that behave like private goods. And then for those that are really public goods, we shouldn't consider the per capita definition, but the total. And in that case, automatically, to the extent that there is a tax payment, total revenues will go up.
All right.
Okay, so if he didn't ask that question, I would have. So yeah, it's very relevant for a lot of the work we do in depopulating areas, and really happy to hear a lot of your research. It could be quite relevant for a lot of the policy areas we work at, particularly at the Center for Entrepreneurship. I'm gonna close off the session by saying thank you to you and everyone here. and maybe taking a brief moment to just announce that we're going to have our next seminar. So you are the last one of the year. We're very thankful that you're here with us. We're starting again in January with Ionesca Marinescu, who's coming from the University of Pennsylvania, a competition expert presenting some of her work on local labor markets. We're trying to convince her not to go on migration again, but as you can see, so I'm really pleased to have everyone in again for next year, and happy New Year to everyone. Thank you.